Houston, Texas, April 28, 1967. The most famous athlete in the world stood perfectly still. Around him, young men shuffled forward one by one, names were called, steps were taken, futures were sealed. The induction center smelled of floor wax and fear. That particular government smell that reminds you how small you are against the machinery of a nation at war. Muhammad Ali heard his name, or rather the name they insisted on calling him, Cassius Clay. He didn't move. The officer called again, louder this time, as if volume could compel obedience. Cassius Clay, step forward. 25 years old, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, the most recognizable face on the planet. A man who had knocked out Sonny Liston, who had danced and jabbed and talked his way into history, who had renamed himself against America's wishes. This man stood rooted to the linoleum floor like an oak tree that had decided after centuries that it would not bend to any wind. And in that moment of stillness, Muhammad Ali made a choice that would cost him everything. But what nobody knew that morning was that this single act of defiance would echo through decades, to movements, through the very soul of a nation that hadn't yet learned to listen. The story really begins 9 months earlier, in a different kind of arena. February 1966. Ali had just defended his title against Ernie Terrell. He was unstoppable in the ring. Fast hands, faster mouth. A combination that had made him both beloved and despised in equal measure. The sports writers couldn't decide if he was the greatest boxer they'd ever seen, or an insufferable loudmouth who needed to be humbled. Then came the letter. The Selective Service System had reclassified him, 1A, eligible for military service. The Vietnam War was swallowing young American men by the thousands, and now it wanted the heavyweight champion. Reporters ambushed him outside his Miami training camp, microphones thrust forward like weapons. They expected the usual Ali show, the poetry, the predictions, the theatrical outrage. What they got instead were 7 words that would reshape American culture. I ain't got no quarrel with them Vietcong. The sentence hung in the humid Florida air, simple, direct, devastating. He continued, and what he said next cut even deeper. No Vietcong ever called me. To understand the earthquake these words caused, you have to understand America in The Vietnam War was not yet the national shame it would become. Dissent was unpatriotic. Protest was suspicious, and for a black man, especially a famous black man, to publicly refuse service, that wasn't just controversial, it was unthinkable. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Newspaper editorials called him a coward, a traitor, a disgrace to his race. Politicians demanded he be stripped of his title. Veterans groups organized boycott. The Louisville sponsoring group, the consortium of white businessmen who had backed his early career, distanced themselves. Television contracts evaporated overnight. But something else happened too. Something the establishment hadn't anticipated. On college campuses, in black neighborhoods, in living rooms where families gathered around televisions, people heard Ali's words and felt something shift. Here was a man who had everything: fame, money, the heavyweight championship of the world, and he was willing to risk all of it for a principle. The question that kept surfacing: what did he have that made him so certain? The answer lay in a journey that had begun 4 years earlier. In a Miami mosque, young Cassius Clay, fresh off his Olympic gold medal, had wandered into a nation of Islam meeting almost by accident. He was curious, searching, a young black man in Jim Crow America, trying to understand why the country he'd represented on the world stage still treated him as less than human. The Nation of Islam offered answers, not comfortable answers but clear ones. White America was the oppressor. Integration was a fantasy. Black people needed to build their own nation, their own economy, their own destiny. Malcolm X became his mentor, his guide into this new understanding. The two were inseparable for months, traveling together, praying together, reimagining what it meant to be black and proud in a world that wanted neither. When Clay defeated Sonny Liston in February 1964, and announced the next day that he was now Muhammad Ali, it wasn't just a name change, it was a declaration of independence. Cassius Clay had been a slave name, imposed by owners who had stripped his ancestors of their African identities. Muhammad Ali was his choice, his faith, his future. America responded with fury. The boxing establishment refused to call him by his new name. Sports writers deliberately used Clay as an insult. His first marriage collapsed under the pressure. Endorsement deals disappeared. But Ali had discovered something more valuable than money or approval. He had discovered conviction. And now, in the spring of 1967, that conviction faced its ultimate test. The legal machinery ground forward with terrible efficiency. Ali's lawyers argued for conscientious objector status. He was, after all, a minister in the Nation of Islam. The Justice Department rejected the claim. The draft board wasn't interested in religious nuance. This was wartime, and warriors were needed. April 28 approached like a verdict. The night before his induction date, Ali barely slept. He prayed. He called his mother in Louisville, and she wept on the phone, terrified of what the government might do to her son. He called Herbert Muhammad, his manager, who reminded him that the Nation of Islam expected him to stand firm. He called Bundini Brown, his cornerman, who offered no advice at all, just the words he always offered before a fight: float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. But this wouldn't be a fight with gloves. There would be no referee, no rounds, no crowd chanting his name, just a linoleum floor, a government official with a clipboard, and a choice that would define everything. The Houston Induction Center at 701 San Jacinto Street was surrounded by protesters when Ali arrived. Some carried signs supporting him, others screamed traitor and were. Police formed a corridor, and Ali walked through it with the same grace he brought to the ring, eyes forward, shoulders back, moving like a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. Inside, the ritual proceeded as it always did. Young men lined up, names called. Step forward, raise your right hand, become government property. 26 men were being inducted that day. Ali was by design to be called last. The military wanted no distractions during the other ceremonies. They would deal with the famous troublemaker when the cameras were ready. At 1:05 p.m., a Navy lieutenant spoke the name that Ali had rejected 3 years earlier: Cassius Clay. Nothing. Cassius Clay, please step forward. Ali remained motionless. Around him, the air seemed to thicken. Officers exchanged glances. A court reporter's fingers hovered frozen above her stenotype machine. A supervising officer approached Ali directly. Do you understand what happens if you refuse? Ali's voice was calm, almost gentle. Yes, sir. I understand. They took him to a private room and explained the consequences again: 5 years in federal prison, a $10,000 fine, the destruction of everything he had built. They gave him one more chance. Ali shook his head. At 1:47 p.m. he was escorted from the building. Within hours, the New York State Athletic Commission had stripped him of his boxing license. Within days, every other state commission followed. The World Boxing Association took his title, the championship he had never lost in the ring, taken by men in suits who had never thrown a punch. Muhammad Ali, at 25 years old, was no longer the heavyweight champion of the world. He was a man without a profession, facing prison, reviled by millions of his countrymen, and he had never been more certain of anything in his life. What followed were the wilderness years. From 1967 to 1970, Muhammad Ali could not box. Not in America, not anywhere that respected American authority. His passport was confiscated. His income vanished. The phone stopped ringing with offers. The entourage that had surrounded him during the glory days melted away like morning frost. He was 25 when they took his title. 26, 27, 28, 29. These were supposed to be his prime years, the years when his speed and reflexes and impossible beauty in the ring would have produced performances for the ages. Instead, he traveled the country speaking at colleges, for whatever fees he could collect. He was broke. He was reviled. He was absolutely defiantly unbowed. The curious thing about those years is what happened to the country while Ali was in exile. 1968 brought the Tet Offensive, and suddenly the war that Americans had been assured was nearly won looked like something else entirely. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, Robert Kennedy in June. Cities burned. The Democratic Convention in Chicago collapsed into chaos and tear gas. Young men were dying in Vietnamese jungles at a rate of 300 per week, and the body bags kept coming home, and the promises kept proving hollow. By 1969, the anti-war movement had grown from a radical fringe to a mainstream force. College students who had once mocked Ali's stand began to see him differently. Veterans returned home and questioned what they had fought for. Mothers who had sent sons to war and received flags in return found themselves asking the same questions Ali had asked years earlier. What exactly were we fighting for, and why? The legal battleground on in parallel with the cultural shift. Ali's case wound through federal courts with agonizing slowness. He was convicted of draft evasion in June 1967. Guilty verdict, 5 years, $10,000. His lawyers appealed. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. They appealed again. The case crawled toward the Supreme Court, while Ali's prime years disappeared into history. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening. The same sports establishment that had enthusiastically stripped Ali of his title began to fracture. Young athletes, black and white, started speaking out against the war. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, refused to play for the Olympic basketball team. Track stars Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised black power fists on the medal podium in Mexico City. The world of sports, once a refuge from politics, had become a battleground, and at the center of it all, in exile but not forgotten, stood Muhammad Ali. In October 1970, a federal judge in Atlanta ruled that the Georgia State Athletic Commission's refusal to license Ali was unconstitutional. The legal reasoning was technical, something about inconsistent application of standards, but the result was revolutionary. Ali could fight again. His return bout against Jerry Quarrel drew the largest closed-circuit television audience in history. Ali won in 3 rounds, but the victory was almost beside the point. What mattered was that he was back, that the exile was ending, that the man who had sacrificed everything for his principles had not been destroyed by that sacrifice. But the legal cloud remained, the conviction still stood, prison still loomed. On June 28, 1971, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its ruling in Clave, United States. 8 justices participated. Thurgood Marshall had recused himself because of his previous role as Solicitor General. The decision was unanimous. 8A conviction overturned. The technical grounds were narrow. The Justice Department had given the draft board incorrect advice about Ali's conscientious objector claim, but the message was unmistakable. The highest court in the land had declared that Muhammad Ali should never have been prosecuted in the first place. The 4 years of exile, the lost championship, the destroyed prime, all of it had been unjust. Ali received the news at his Chicago home. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, as if the universe had finally corrected an obvious error, and began preparing for his next fight. The fights that followed would become legend. The fight of the century against Joe Frazier in March 1971. A loss. His first professional defeat, but a loss that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his mystique. The rematch 2 years later. A victory that set the stage for what was to come. And then, in October 1974, the impossible. Kinshasa, Zaire. The rumble in the jungle. George Foreman was supposed to destroy him. Foreman had knocked out Frazier in 2 rounds. Foreman had demolished Ken Norton, the man who had broken Ali's jaw. Foreman hit harder than anyone in heavyweight history. And Ali was 32 years old, past his prime, slowed by the years of exile. A shell of the dancer who had floated like a butterfly against Liston a decade earlier. 60,000 Africans chanted Ali Bamai Ali, kill him, and the man who had refused to kill for his country absorbed punch after punch against the ropes, letting Foreman exhaust himself, waiting, until the 8th round when he exploded off the ropes and sent the unbeatable champion crashing to the canvas. It was the most famous victory in sports history, and it belonged to a man who 7 years earlier had been willing to give up victories entirely. How do you measure the cost of conviction? Muhammad Ali lost 3.5 years of his boxing career, years that can never be recovered, fights that will never happen, performances that exist only in imagination. Financial analysts have estimated the lost earnings in the tens of millions of dollars. The physical toll of fighting past his prime, of needing to extend his career to recoup what he'd lost, may have contributed to the Parkinson's disease that would claim the last 3 decades of his life. But how do you measure what he gained? What the world gained? Ali's stand against the Vietnam War didn't end the war. It didn't bring the troops home, or stop the bombing, or save the lives lost in rice paddies and jungle clearings. But it changed something in the American consciousness. It demonstrated that fame could be used for something other than selling products. It showed young people,
especially young black people, that resistance was possible, that principles could trump profit, that a single person standing on conviction could shake an empire. The sports journalist Robert Lipsyte, who covered Ali throughout his career, put it simply: he was the first athlete to use his platform to speak truth to power. Every athlete who has done so since stands on his shoulders. Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, LeBron James speaking out against police brutality, Megan Rapinoe refusing to visit the White House, all of them descendants, whether they know it or not, of a young man who stood still on a linoleum floor in Houston and refused to take a single step. Years later, a reporter asked Ali if he had any regrets about refusing induction. He was older then, his speech slowed by Parkinson's, his hands trembling where they had once thrown lightning, but his eyes were clear, and his answer was immediate. "I'm proud of it," he said. "It was the best thing that happened to me. It made me think about what I believe. It made me stand up." The reporter pressed, "But what about the lost years, the championship, the money?" Ali smiled, that familiar mischievous, utterly undiminished smile. "I had something better," he said. "I had my soul." On April 28, 1967, Muhammad Ali refused to step forward. In doing so, he stepped into history. The 7 words he spoke, "I ain't got no quarrel with Vietcong," did not stop a war. They did not prevent a single death in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They did not immediately change American policy or public opinion or the machinery of military conscription, but they planted a seed. They gave voice to a doubt that millions felt but few dared express. They demonstrated that courage exists, not only in the ring, where fists fly and crowds roar, but in quiet rooms where a man must choose between conscience and consequence. Muhammad Ali could have stepped forward. He could have served his time, done his duty, returned to boxing with his reputation intact and his future secure. He could have been a good soldier, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he became something rarer. He became a man who, when asked to betray his principles, simply said no. And the world is still learning from that no, still drawing strength from it, still trying to understand what it means to sacrifice everything for something that cannot be taken away. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, stand like a mountain. That was Muhammad Ali. That is his gift to us all.